They called it a relic, a rusty piece of junk better suited for a museum than a hunting camp. When 78-year-old Walter Briggs pulled a weathered World War II-era bayonet from his pack and laid it on the tailgate of his truck, 3 younger hunters burst out laughing so hard one of them nearly choked on his energy drink. They had no idea that blade had been sharpened on a volcanic rock on the bloodiest beach in the Pacific. They had no idea the hands holding it had once saved the lives of 11 Marines with nothing but that steel and a dead man's courage. And they had absolutely no idea that before the weekend was over, that same bayonet would do something none of their $400 custom skinning knives could manage. If this story moves you, type respect in the comments, and stay until the very end, because what happened in that elk camp in the mountains of Montana will change the way you look at every quiet old man you ever meet again. Walter Briggs had lived in the same small house on the outskirts of Darby, Montana, for going on 41 years. It was a modest place, white-clapboard siding that needed painting, a porch that sagged slightly on the left side where the foundation had settled, and a yard full of wild grass he only mowed when the neighbours started giving him looks. He had moved there in 1983, a year after his wife Helen passed from pancreatic cancer, because the Bitterroot Valley reminded him of silence, and silence was something Walter had learned to love the way most men learn to love whiskey. Slowly, painfully, and then completely. He walked with a cane now, a simple wooden thing he had carved himself from a piece of lodgepole pine after his left knee finally gave out 2 winters back. The doctors told him it was arthritis compounded by old injuries. Walter never told the doctors where those old injuries came from. He never told anyone much of anything, really. He was the kind of man who could sit on a bench outside the hardware store for 3 hours and never say more than good morning and have a nice day. People in Derby knew him as the quiet old-timer with the cane and the faded blue truck, the one who always wore the same olive green field jacket regardless of the season, the one who put flags on veterans' graves every Memorial Day but never talked about his own service. Some of the younger people in town assumed he had never served at all, that maybe the jacket was just something he picked up at a surplus store. They assumed a lot of things about Walter Briggs, and every single one of those assumptions was wrong. The elk hunting trip was organised by a man named Craig Dunlap, a 44-year-old real estate agent from Missoula, who fancied himself an outdoorsman because he owned a lot of expensive gear and subscribed to 3 different hunting magazines. Craig had been coming to the Bitterroot for elk season for 6 years running, and each year he brought along a rotating crew of buddies who shared his enthusiasm for brand-name camouflage and high-powered rifles with scopes that cost more than Walter's truck. This year's crew included Craig's younger brother Ty, a 36-year-old personal trainer with arms the size of fence posts, and a voice that never seemed to find a volume below loud, and a man named Derek Solis, 39, who ran a CrossFit gym in Helena and had the kind of beard that looked like it had been shaped by a professional. They arrived in Derby on a Thursday afternoon in a convoy of 3 brand new trucks, each one polished and gleaming, loaded with enough equipment to outfit a small military operation. Craig had invited Walter almost as an afterthought. He had met the old man at the gas station a week earlier and mentioned the trip, and Walter had said quietly that he used to hunt elk in these mountains 50 years ago. Craig thought it would be a nice gesture. Bring the old guy along, let him sit by the fire and tell stories. He never expected Walter to actually bring a weapon he intended to use, let alone one that looked like it belonged in a history textbook. They set up base camp at a spot Craig had used before, a clearing at about 6,000 feet on the eastern slope of Trapper Peak, surrounded by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, with a creek running maybe 200 yards to the south. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine resin and wet earth. Ty and Derek made quick work of the tents, military-style pop-up shelters with built-in heating units and inflatable sleeping pads. Walter set up his own tent, a 30-year-old canvas A-frame he carried in a duffel bag, working slowly and methodically, driving stakes into the frozen ground with a small mallet. Nobody offered to help him. They were too busy arranging their gear on a folding table Craig had brought, laying out knives and tools like surgeons preparing for an operation. Craig had a custom forged skinning knife with a 4-inch drop-point blade and a hand-turned walnut handle. He said he had paid $380 for it from a bladesmith in Idaho. Ty had a similar model, slightly larger, with a stag antler handle. Derek preferred a modern tactical knife, a fixed blade design with a rubberized grip and a tanto-style point. They compared their blades the way men compare anything they have spent too much money on, with exaggerated reverence and thinly veiled competition. That was when Walter walked over to the tailgate of his truck and unrolled a piece of oiled canvas revealing the bayonet. It was a M1 bayonet, the kind issued to Marines who carried the M1 Garand rifle during the Second World War. 16 inches of carbon steel with a black handle that had been worn smooth by decades of use. The blade was not shiny, it was not pretty, it had a matte, dark patina that spoke of age, oil, and careful maintenance. There were small nicks along the edge, tiny imperfections that told the story of a tool that had been used for things far more demanding than cutting rope. Walter held it in his right hand, feeling its familiar weight, and set it down gently beside the other knives on the table. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Ty laughed. It started as a snort, the kind of involuntary sound a man makes when something catches him off guard, and then it rolled into a full, loud, head-thrown-back laugh that echoed off the trees. Derek joined in almost immediately, shaking his head, his expensive beard quivering with amusement. Even Craig, who at least had the decency to look a little uncomfortable, could not suppress a grin. Ty picked up the bayonet without asking, turned it over in his hands and said something about how his grandfather had one just like it hanging over his fireplace where it belonged. Derek said it looked like something you would use to pry open a paint can, not dress an elk. Ty asked Walter, with the exaggerated politeness young men use when they think they are being funny, whether he had also brought a musket. Walter said nothing. He reached forward, took the bayonet back from Ty's hands with a gentleness that was almost fatherly, wrapped it in the oiled canvas and tucked it into his pack. His face showed nothing. Not anger, not embarrassment, not hurt, just the kind of patience that only comes from having endured things so far beyond a campsite joke that the joke itself barely registers as a sound. He turned and walked back to his tent, his cane pressing small round holes into the frozen dirt, and the 3 younger men went back to admiring their knives as though nothing had happened. The first 2 days of the hunt produced little. Craig and his crew glassed the ridgelines from dawn to dusk, hiked miles of game trails, and set up in promising spots near water and feeding areas. But the elk were not cooperating. The herd had moved higher than expected, pushed up by an early warming trend that melted snow at the lower elevations. Walter, for his part, did not join the long hikes. His knee would not allow it. Instead, he spent his mornings sitting on a fallen log near camp, watching the tree line with a pair of old binoculars, and his afternoons walking short distances along the creek, reading the ground the way a man reads a newspaper. He found tracks the others had missed, noted where the bark had been stripped from aspens at a height that suggested a mature bull, studied droppings and estimated their age by temperature and consistency. He mentioned some of these observations to Craig on the second evening, pointing out that the elk were likely moving along a particular saddle between 2 ridges just before dawn, following a route that would bring them across an open meadow about a mile northwest of camp. Craig listened politely, nodded, and then told Ty and Derek they should try the south ridge again in the morning. Walter did not repeat himself. He simply nodded, poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin pot on the fire, and went to bed. On the 3rd morning everything changed. Craig, Ty, and Derek left camp before first light, headed south as planned. Walter woke at 4:30, dressed in the dark, and walked the mile northwest to the meadow he had identified. He moved slowly, his cane finding solid ground in the darkness, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn cold. He reached the meadow just as the sky began to lighten, a vast open space of brown grass and frost, ringed by dark timber on 3 sides. He found a position behind a deadfall at the meadow's edge, settled himself with his back against a tree, and waited. At 6:14 the elk appeared. Not 1 or 2, but a herd of nearly 20, led by a cow that picked her way carefully across the frozen grass, and behind them, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of an animal that has survived many seasons, was a bull elk that made Walter's breath catch. It was enormous, a 6x7, maybe 400 inches of antler, with a body that must have weighed close to 900 pounds on the hoof. It was the kind of bull that hunters talk about for the rest of their lives, the kind of animal that ends up on the cover of magazines and mounted on the walls of lodges. Walter did not have a modern rifle with a 20-power scope. He had a Remington Model 700 in 30-06 that he had bought in 1971, with iron sights he had never bothered to replace. He let the herd move into the meadow, let the bull separate slightly from the cows as it paused to test the air. At 140 yards, Walter steadied the rifle against the deadfall, found the crease behind the front shoulder, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed. The shot cracked across the meadow like a branch breaking. The bull took 2 steps, staggered, and went down on its front knees, then collapsed onto its side. The herd exploded in every direction, crashing into the timber with a sound like rolling thunder. And then there was silence. Walter sat still for a full 5 minutes, watching the bull, making sure it was done. Then he stood, picked up his cane, and began the slow walk across the meadow to the largest elk anyone in the Bitterroot Valley had seen in 20 years. Craig, Ty, and Derek heard the shot from the south ridge and came running. It took them nearly an hour to reach the meadow, following the sound and then Walter's tracks in the frost. When they broke through the tree line and saw the bull lying in the grass, they stopped dead. Craig actually said the word impossible out loud. Ty dropped his pack and jogged over to the animal, circling it with the wide-eyed disbelief of a man who has just been shown that everything he thought he knew was wrong. Derek stood at the edge of the meadow, shaking his head, doing the math in his mind, trying to understand how a 78-year-old man with a cane and a rifle from the Nixon administration had just taken the trophy of a lifetime while they had spent 3 days chasing shadows on the wrong ridge. Walter was sitting on a rock near the bull, drinking water from a canteen, his cane leaning against his knee. He looked up at them and said simply that the elk had come through the saddle just like he had figured. He did not say "I told you so." He did not need to. The bull said it for him. The congratulations were genuine but brief, because now they had a problem. A 900-pound elk does not process itself. Field dressing an animal that size is a serious undertaking, a task that requires skill, strength, and the right tools, and it needs to happen quickly to prevent the meat from spoiling. Craig, who had field dressed several elk in his years of hunting, volunteered to take the lead. He pulled out his $380 custom knife and knelt beside the bull with the confidence of a man who has watched a lot of YouTube tutorials. But the reality of this animal was different from anything Craig had encountered before. The hide was thick, far thicker than the younger, smaller elk he had processed in the past. The layers of fat and connective tissue were dense and unyielding. His beautiful drop-point blade, designed for precision work on moderate-sized game, struggled almost immediately. The edge dulled faster than he expected against the tough hide. His cuts were uneven, ragged, tearing the membrane around the gut cavity rather than slicing it cleanly. Ty took over after 15 minutes, his larger knife faring only slightly better. His approach was based on brute force, sawing and pulling where finesse was needed, and he nicked the stomach lining within the first few cuts, releasing a smell that made Derek gag and turn away. Derek refused to take a turn after that. He stood back, arms crossed, and suggested they call someone with a winch and a chainsaw. They were making a mess. The gut cavity was compromised, meat was being contaminated, and the clock was ticking. The morning sun was climbing, and warmth was the enemy of fresh game. Craig wiped his knife on his pants and stared at the animal with the frustrated expression of a man who's just realized that owning expensive equipment and knowing how to use it are two very different things. That was when Walter stood up from his rock. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not make a speech. He just rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked over to where his pack was leaning against the deadfall. He unwrapped the oiled canvas and took out the bayonet. He limped over to the elk, lowered himself carefully to his knees, and positioned himself beside the animal with the practiced ease of someone who has done this exact thing 1,000 times. Craig started to say something, maybe an offer to help, maybe a polite suggestion that the old man let someone with a real knife handle it, but the words died in his throat when Walter made the first cut. The bayonet moved through the elk's hide like it was paper, not with force, not with sawing, with a single, fluid draw stroke that opened a line from the sternum to the pelvis so clean and straight it looked like it had been made with a surgical scalpel. The 3 younger hunters stood in absolute silence. Walter worked with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Each movement was precise and economical, the blade finding the exact line between hide and muscle, between organ and membrane, as though he could see through the animal's skin to the architecture beneath. He separated the diaphragm with 2 quick cuts, freed the windpipe and esophagus with a technique that involved rolling the blade rather than pulling it, a motion so efficient that the organs came loose in one connected mass. He reached into the chest cavity and removed the heart and lungs in a single smooth extraction that left no tears, no punctures, no wasted meat. The gut pile came out intact, every organ undamaged, the inner cavity as clean as if it had been washed. He opened the pelvis with a precise strike of the bayonet's spine, splitting the bone along a seam that the younger men had not even known existed. Then he began quartering. The technique Walter used was not something from a hunting manual. It was not something you could learn from a magazine or a video. It was a method born in desperation on the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, where 19-year-old Private First Class Walter Briggs had landed with the 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, on the first wave of the invasion. On that island, supplies were chaos. Equipment was lost in the surf. Men went days without proper food. When they managed to capture Japanese provisions or slaughter one of the few wild goats on the island, they had no butcher tools. What they had were bayonets, and a sergeant named Harold Kaneko, a third-generation Japanese-American from Sacramento who had enlisted despite his own family being held in an internment camp in Utah, taught Walter and every man in his squad how to break down an animal with nothing but a bayonet and the knowledge of anatomy that Kaneko had learned from his father, who had been a butcher in a shop on J Street. Kaneko showed them the connective tissue lines, showed them where joints could be separated with rotation rather than force, showed them how to use the length of the blade as an advantage, drawing it through tissue in long controlled strokes rather than short hacking motions. He called it following the architecture. He said every animal was a building, and if you understood where the walls and doorways were, you could take it apart without ever forcing anything. Kaneko was killed on the 4th day of the battle, hit by a mortar round while carrying water to a wounded corpsman in a shell hole near the base of Mount Suribachi. Walter had carried Kaneko's body back to the aid station on his own back, over 200 yards of open ground under fire. The bayonet Walter carried now was not his own original issue. It was Kaneko's. Walter had kept it for 81 years. He had sharpened it on the same volcanic rock where Kaneko had first showed him how to hold it. And he had used it every hunting season since he came home from the Pacific, processing deer and elk and antelope with the same method Kaneko had taught him, in a foxhole, while mortars shook the earth around them. The blade had never been reground, never been professionally sharpened on a machine. Walter maintained it the way Kaneko had showed him, with a whetstone and oil at a 17-degree angle, working both sides evenly until the edge could split a hair. It was not a relic. It was the most carefully maintained cutting tool in the state of Montana. Walter finished quartering the elk in under 40 minutes. The forequarters, the back straps, the tenderloins, the neck meat, and the rib sections were laid out on a clean tarp in orderly rows, each cut precise, each piece trimmed of silver skin and connective tissue with the casual efficiency of a master butcher. There was almost no wasted meat. The sections were clean enough to take directly to a processor without any additional trimming. Craig, Ty, and Derek had not moved during the entire process. They stood in a loose semicircle, knives hanging forgotten at their sides, watching with the kind of reverent silence that usually accompanies something sacred. Ty was the first to speak. His voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the loud, easy confidence that had characterized every word he had spoken since arriving in camp. He asked Walter where he had learned to do that. Walter wiped the bayonet on a cloth, folded it back into its oiled canvas, and looked at Ty for a long moment before answering. He said he learned it on a beach a long time ago from a man who deserved to come home but did not. That was all he said. He did not elaborate. He did not name the battle. He did not describe the horror of Iwo Jima or the 36 days of fighting that killed nearly 7,000 Marines and wounded another 20,000. He did not tell them about the nights he still woke up hearing the sound of Japanese artillery, or the way the black sand had gotten into everything, into wounds, into food, into the mechanisms of rifles, into dreams that never fully ended. He did not tell them that he had been awarded the Silver Star for carrying Kaneko back under fire, or that the medal was in a drawer in his bedroom under a pile of old socks, because he could not look at it without seeing Harold Kaneko's face, young and alive and patient, showing a scared kid from Montana how to hold a bayonet like it was something worth respecting. Craig walked over to Walter and extended his hand. It was not a casual handshake. It was the kind of grip a man offers when he is trying to communicate something he does not have the vocabulary for. Ty apologized. Not for any specific remark. Not for the laughter at the tailgate. Just a quiet, general apology that covered everything. The assumptions, the jokes, the decision to ignore Walter's advice about where the elk would be. Derek said nothing, but he picked up Walter's pack and carried it the entire mile back to camp without being asked. They spent the rest of that afternoon packing out the meat in game bags, making multiple trips between the meadow and camp, and Walter supervised the process from his rock, directing them on how to keep the meat clean and cool during transport. That evening, around the fire, something had shifted. The dynamic of the camp had changed completely. Craig asked Walter about his hunting history, and Walter, perhaps warmed by the fire and the whiskey, and the unexpected respect of men half his age, began to talk. Not about the war, not about Iwo Jima, but about the elk, about the mountains, about how the herds had moved over the decades, how the meadows had changed, how the aspens were thicker now than they were in the 1970s and the creek ran lower in the fall. He told them about a 12-point bull he had taken in 1987, the year before his knees started to go, how he had tracked it for 3 days through snow so deep he had to fashion makeshift snowshoes from willow branches. He told them about hunting with his wife Helen, who was a better shot than he was, and who had once dropped a mule deer at 260 yards with her father's old Winchester, while Walter was still trying to find the animal in his binoculars. The 3 younger men listened without interruption. They did not check their phones. They did not crack jokes. They sat in the firelight and listened the way people listen when they understand they are in the presence of something that cannot be purchased at a sporting goods store or learned from a subscription. Before they broke camp the following morning, Ty asked if he could see the bayonet one more time. Walter unwrapped it and handed it to him. This time Ty held it differently, not like a curiosity or a punchline, but the way you hold something that carries weight beyond its physical measure. He turned it slowly, studying the blade, the wear on the handle, the small nicks that told stories he could not read. He asked Walter if the notches meant anything. Walter said they were not notches, just marks from use, from cutting through things harder than elk hide on days he would rather not remember. Ty handed the bayonet back and thanked him. Not for the demonstration with the elk, though that was part of it. For bringing it, he said. For still carrying it after all these years. Derek, who had been quiet most of the morning, asked Walter if he would come back next season. Walter looked out at the mountains, the peaks already catching the first light, snow glowing orange against the pale sky, and said he supposed he would if his knees would let him. Craig said he would pick him up personally, and he meant it. When Walter got home to Derby, he unwrapped the bayonet one more time and laid it on the kitchen table under the light. He ran his thumb along the flat of the blade, feeling the steel, cool and familiar. He could almost hear Kaneko's voice, calm and patient, explaining the angle, the pressure, the motion. Follow the architecture, Walter. Every animal is a building. Walter smiled, something he did not do often, and it changed his whole face, softened the deep lines, brought something back to his eyes that had been missing for a long time. He wrapped the bayonet carefully, placed it back in the canvas, and set it on the shelf by the door where it always waited for the next season. Outside, the Bitterroot Valley stretched south under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and somewhere up in those mountains the elk were moving through the timber, following trails they had worn for 1,000 years, and the old man with the cane stood at his window and watched the light change on the peaks and felt, for the first time in a while, like he still had something worth carrying. In the weeks that followed, Craig Dunlap did something he had never done before. He contacted the local VFW chapter in Hamilton and asked about Walter Briggs. What he learned left him sitting in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring through the windshield at nothing. Private First Class Walter Briggs had served with the 5th Marine Division during the Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest engagements in Marine Corps history. He had been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry, the Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and the Navy Commendation Medal. He had been part of the assault on Mount Suribachi. He had spent 36 days on that island, and he had carried 3 wounded Marines to safety under fire, in addition to bringing back the body of Sergeant Harold Kaneko. He had been 19 years old. Craig called Ty that afternoon and told him. Then he called Derek. None of them said much. There was not much to say. They had spent 3 days in the company of a man who had done things at 19 that most people cannot imagine at any age, and they had laughed at his knife. Craig organised a dinner at the VFW Hall in Hamilton that December, ostensibly a holiday gathering for local hunters, but really it was for Walter. He invited everyone he knew. 60 people showed up. When Walter walked in, leaning on his cane, wearing his olive field jacket, Craig stood up and asked the room for quiet. He did not tell Walter's full story, because that was not his story to tell. He said only that he had recently gone on a hunting trip with a man who had taught him that the value of a tool is not determined by its price tag, and the value of a man is not determined by his appearance, and that sometimes the people who have done the most talk about it the least. He asked Walter to stand, and the room, many of whom had known the quiet old man for decades, without knowing what he carried, rose to their feet and applauded. Walter stood there for a moment, his hand on the back of his chair, his eyes bright, and gave a single short nod. The kind of nod a Marine gives, acknowledgement without performance, gratitude without spectacle. And then he sat back down, picked up his coffee, and asked the man next to him how the deer season had been. The following spring, Craig drove to Derby and helped Walter replace the sagging boards on his porch. Ty came the next weekend and fixed the foundation on the left side. Derek, who turned out to be a decent carpenter when he was not doing CrossFit, rebuilt the front steps. They did not make a big deal about it. They just showed up, worked, and sat on the new porch afterward drinking beer while Walter told them about the time a black bear had gotten into his truck in 1991 and eaten an entire bag of apples and a package of beef jerky before Walter chased it off by banging a pot with a spoon. The three younger men laughed at that story differently than they had laughed at the Bayonet. They laughed with him now, not at him. And that is a difference as wide as the Pacific Ocean. Harold Kaneko never came home from Iwo Jima. He was 23 years old when he died, a Japanese-American who fought for a country that had locked up his family behind barbed wire, and he did it with a patience and a dignity that Walter Briggs had spent 81 years trying to live up to. The Bayonet was Kaneko's legacy, a piece of steel that carried within it a lesson about precision, about respect for the work, about finding the architecture in things and following it instead of forcing your way through. Walter had carried that lesson from a beach made of volcanic ash to the mountains of Montana, and on a cold morning in an elk meadow he had passed it on, without words, without explanation, with nothing but the quiet authority of a man who had learned the hardest lessons in the hardest possible school and had the grace to make them look effortless. Some lessons cannot be taught in a classroom or a gym or a hunting magazine. Some lessons can only come from a man with a cane and a bayonet and 81 years of silence, standing over an elk in a frozen meadow, doing what needed to be done while younger men with better tools stood back and watched and understood, finally, that they were in the presence of something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to earn. The mountains do not care about your gear. The elk do not care about your brand. And the old man with the bayonet does not care about your opinion. He only cares that the work is done right, the way he was taught, by a man who deserved to come home but did not, on an island none of them could find on a map. If you believe that respect is not given by appearance but earned by action, subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and the next time you see a quiet old man with a worn tool and a steady hand, do yourself a favour. Pay attention. You might just learn something that no amount of money can buy,